packet pushers.
Welcome to the IPv6 Buzz, where we dare to dive into the 128-bit address space wormhole. I'm Ed Horley.
And I'm Scott Hogue. On the show, we discuss all things IPv6, strategy, design, deployment, and operations.
And I'm Tom Coffeen. We've spent 20 plus years working with the IPv6 protocol. We run a consulting firm where we get IPv6 working for our customers.
And we're here to share some lessons learned and how to avoid common mistakes. We're glad you joined us today. We have returning guest and IETF working group co-chair for V6 Ops, Nick Buraglio. Nick, welcome. It's good to have you back, man.
Oh, I'm always happy to come on. I have to retain my status as most frequent guest.
Well, it's good to have you here. And we wanted to chat about your effort around getting the new documentation prefix space for IPv6. So why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about, how and why this sort of came about? What was the effort all about?
I think we need to go back pretty far to find the sort of wellspring that this came out of. And for the listeners, we're talking about RFC 9637, expanding the IPv6 documentation space, which is an update to RFC 3849. So actually, Ed, you were one of the, if not probably the person that sort of spawned this back in 2021. I believe it was about April of 2021. We started talking about needing lab and documentation space, and there was a handful of us that were cooped up, due to being isolated in the height of early 2021. And we thought, oh, we have some time, let's figure out how to do this. And at the time, at least I had never done anything other than lurk on the IETF mailing lists, but we started looking at, what it would take to sort of build a update for the legacy doc space, which is only a /32, which I'm sure you've got a list of podcasts that sort of illustrate like, hey, this isn't big enough. We need something bigger.
And I remember it was, I think Russ White was helping us.
Yep.
Kevin Myers and a handful of others had their fingers in the pie too, because we were all chipping in and trying to figure it out, because Russ was the only one with any real IETF experience in terms of shepherding anything forward. So the rest of us were in learning mode, I think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Russ was really instrumental in making this happen because he taught us basically what to do. How do you interact with the IETF and what's the process? Because unless you have done it before, it's all documented and everything, but it's not necessarily all in the same places. So he kind of taught us the mechanics of what we needed to do to get started. And so we wrote a couple of drafts, actually, asking for expanded documentation space and allocating space for lab work. We did a couple of things too, 6724 work that is actually still ongoing. And it, it wasn't terribly well received. I think, I was pretty new and I tend to be a little bit bullish when it comes to stuff like that out of the gate, just to see how far it can push. And it didn't really go very far. But then over the course of the next couple of years, I really enjoyed working in the IETF, and I started just doing more things and figuring out what would potentially work for some of the stuff we'd originally intended to do. Fast forward to July of last year, actually, several of us were eating dinner and said, I bet we can try to do this again. I said, let me reach out to Jeff Houston, since he wrote the original, and just see what he thinks. Would he be willing to co-author something? And the rest is sort of history. If you look at the data tracker page for RFC 9637, it has obviously the original doc, 3849 is linked to it, and as well as the two drafts that sort of spawned the final RFC.
I think we had decided that it made way more sense to try and get someone who had originally written the first draft and try and have them help to push it forward if they felt the need was there. So I think that was really the goal effort. I think obviously we succeeded.
Yep. It didn't hurt that the document is very straightforward.
Yeah.
It's an easy read. It's like 5 pages, I think, even with all the boilerplate stuff. So it's really straightforward. And I got comments from the RFC editors as well as the area directors that it's just a very easy to sort of digest document. There's nothing really controversial in it. It's just, this is a need that was clearly demonstrated, and, here it is.
I guess we should mention like a couple of the reasons why that need was there in the first place. If the listeners, I don't know how familiar everybody is with using the existing documentation prefix, and just sort of running into issues pretty early on with trying to demonstrate certain things. Like if you start off with the assumption that, like a larger enterprise is going to have at least a /32, then if you want to sort of show like multi-domain, routing domain examples with like your different ISPs and having different enterprises connected with different /32s, you're right out of the gate, you're like your host, because you got the 1/32 you can use, and then you have to figure out, well, how do I depict a network that's entirely behind a different /32? That was one of the initial pain points. And then from my perspective, like doing a lot of address plans for larger enterprises that are getting larger than /32 allocations, again, like being able to model that with documentation space is just not possible with the one existing /32. There are definitely other use cases that cropped up in those initial discussions. And I think that, going back probably several years in the IETF, I think these on the mailing list for V6 ops, I think it probably cropped up in times past, at least here or there. But definitely there was that need, and having that larger documentation spaces solves at least both of those problems that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think history is important here too. So it was almost 20 years exactly ago that the original RFC 3849 was written. 20 years ago, V6 was a very different landscape, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Basically, everyone got a 48. It was hard to find organizations that were actually running V6. A lot of activity in like academia and research and education, and probably beginnings of it in some mobile providers and whatever, but it was definitely not common. And a 32 was considered, I mean, it is massive. It's a huge amount of address space, but it's also now, at least in the Aaron region, sort of the default. Like I personally have a /40, and I had to ask to get that. Like they wanted to give me a 32. I was cheap and I didn't want to pay that much money. So I had to basically figure out what the special language was to ask for something smaller than that. Whereas 20 years ago, like I said, everybody got a 48. So it was much easier to sort of justify like, oh, I can just put everything in here and, this one thing. But now, like you said, you've got people that are getting 29s and, in some cases even larger than that. And when you want to do ISP modeling where you've got, and this is where Kevin was really important in helping justify this, like Kevin Myers does a lot of merger type work for service providers, right? Those service providers are, like you said, Tom, they're each going to have at least a 32. How do you address plan that? Like you're squatting on space at that point to be able to do it within a sane amount of nomenclature.
Yeah. Like 3849 was written in July of 2004. And I think back then, the Internet IETF didn't want to repeat the same mistakes of IPv4, giving out Class A, Class B address space, for V4, didn't want to repeat the same mistake of giving out too much IPv6 address space. So early on, the pendulum was swung all the way to one side of being really conservative, and RIRs had pretty conservative allocation methods and policies. Now, 20 years later, pendulum swung to the other side where it's, okay, we realize we aren't going to run out. We need to be more liberal with how much address space we give organizations. And you see that reflected in the RIR policies. So when 3849 came out, /32 of documentation space probably seemed like a lot at that time. Now, 20 years later, we realize, we could use some more documentation space to reflect RIR policies.
For sure. The amount of networks from 20 years ago that are doing it is significant now. I think we're over that. I've been saying this for, a little bit, and people can push back on it, and I'm sure they will, but I think we're over the bump, right? You may not see it in as many enterprise networks, but V6 is pretty well deployed. It's, I think, here to stay. And, we need to be able to have the tools to be able to manage it and expand it, as required. And this was just part of that.
Yeah. The point of the documentation space was for documentation. And back in 2004, if you were to write a book, what were you going to use? What address space would you use in a textbook or a book like the books we wrote or the IPv6 book you're working on, Nick? What would you use? So you needed address space to talk about IPv6. And so it was necessary early on, to bootstrap and teach and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. And it was Ed that pointed out that there's even, this was probably about a year ago, there's even reasonably new documentation being written by major networking vendors that didn't even use the old documentation space. So perhaps a refresh of, hey, this is available now. Let's use this because, don't squat on someone else's space. I always likened it to the DoD space, right? Oh, we're out of RFC 1980 space. Oh, we're out of the CGN address space. Let's just use the 70./8. And it's like, well, that belongs to somebody. And, you get similar behavior in using either unallocated or allocated to an actual entity V6 space. It's the same problem. right? Somebody's going to cut and paste that in somewhere.
Yeah.
So you want it properly bogon tagged. You want it to be, visually easy to tell the difference. That was another issue I sort of had personally with the older address space allocated in 3849 is it's kind of smack in the middle of the 2000 space. I think it's AppNix.
Yeah, it's a piece of AppNix. So if you're doing bogon filters and you want to filter out just the documentation prefix /32 out of the APNIC block, you have to create 3 different ACL lines.
Yes, indeed. That was a design goal, was to avoid that.
Yeah, I laugh, as you guys do, when you see a vendor come out with brand new documentation and the IPv6 address space they're using is A:/B:C:/D:/64. And I'm like, someone who's reading that and learning about IPv6 will look at that and be like, oh, is that how addressing is done in IPv6? Or you see tons of vendor documentation using FD00:0000. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Or FC.
Oh, yeah, or FC, even better, because that's reserved.
I've also seen for the service provider examples, there's 3,000, there's 4,000, there's 5,000, there's 6,000, and they're using entire blocks.
100::200::. Yeah. Yeah. So you see some strange documentation. And for someone who's learning about IPv6 for the first time, they might think that's the way it's done.
And if you were measuring IPv6 consumption based on vendor examples, you'd be like, oh, we're running out of space. Like they're already in the 4,000 range.
Yes.
Tom, that's when I pull out the handy Tom Coffeen pie chart that I have saved on literally every computer and tablet and phone that I have. When people say, you're wasting IPv6 space, I just pull that picture up and go, really?
Yeah, and I didn't want to blow past that point too quickly because you did mention sort of earlier being over the hump, and I kind of feel the same way. I think probably all of us on the call feel the same way where, we know in the service provider space, the level of IPv6 uptake is pretty massive at this point. And you look at the amount of IPv6 traffic on the internet, somewhere on good days, depending on where you're measuring from, it can be more than half, to the point where you can say, oh, look, IPv4 is the legacy protocol. Whatever metric you sort of use, are we measuring it in tens of percents, in terms of how much IPv6 adoption has happened? And then when you look at the address space that's been consumed, you look at the global unicast allocation and you start breaking it down based on how many /48s, using that as the basic currency to gauge consumption. And you add it all up and you're like, oh, it's only 0.08% of the existing, global unicast allocation, which is only 25% of the existing prefix space. So maybe my sort of back of the napkin analysis is completely off in ways that I haven't really sort of penetrated, by not thinking about it too deeply. But just with that sort of perspective, it's just really sort of beggars belief that anybody's still worried about over consuming IPv6 space at this point.
So you're saying we didn't ask for enough documentation prefix space. Is that what you're saying, Tom?
Boil it all down to just that. We need more documentation space.
Yeah, that was actually probably the hardest part of the entire IETF process, was simply agreeing on how much was enough. And as you can imagine, there's vastly different opinions on what that is. /20 was the amount that we could all agree upon. I mean, I like to say, within the standardization process, I like to think about it as like the ultimate compromise, right? It's where you have this idea and everybody has this idealistic view of what that idea is. And what ends up becoming the standard, essentially, when it makes it all the way through the process, is something simply that everyone can agree upon. It's not necessarily like, if it was me, I probably would have said, make it a /8, right? But I'm not conservative at all when it comes to that. Like, I don't want to do it again in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And that was deemed to be just sort of egregious. And it is,
So my /7 was just too much.
I tend to ask for a lot more than I generally want as a negotiation tactic. So I'm giving away my secrets here. So like when I asked for an 8, I would have been totally happy with a 16 probably, right? But at the end of the day, we got a 20 and a 20 will work. And if you do the math, which Jeff actually did all of the math of what allocations exist, it was fringe. The things that didn't fit into that were pretty fringe. And so there wasn't very many of them. And so that was, what we ended up with.
Except for I think we're going to see a groundswell of requests that come in at the 20 and 16 level.
Well, that's the thing. Having said that, right around the same time, I think this whole approval process was going through for the /20, the first /16 was assigned. That showed up. And then there are probably going to be a couple more that pop up on the radar here pretty soon. So right out of the gate, it's like, well, can't really model that network, not with the new documentation prefix. But
Yeah, that was actually brought up.
Yeah.
Someone brought that to the list, and it generated a storm of controversy and comments.
On the ITF, like, I'm surprised.
Well, it was mostly like, how did they justify that? Like, they can't justify that. And,
Hmm.
we say it all the time. We're not the protocol police, right?
Right,
Yeah,
It's,
and it's not our position to be in whether the justification was good or not. That
yeah.
was Aaron's decision about what to allocate out.
And I think it was David Farmer that eventually he tends to bring a lot of level-headed, sanity. I think it was him. Either way, I should call him out because he's pretty instrumental in this as well as a bunch of other stuff that I'm working on.
He's consistently a voice of reason on so many topics.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. That's the phrase. He's a voice of reason. And, it was like, well, it's not really anybody's call, but you're right. And again, if that does happen, I know how the process works now. We could just do it again.
And I think it was interesting, just for full disclosure, I wrote the Shepherd document for this particular one, got to read through all of the email threads and write down all the opinions and do all of that. And that was a new experience for me. But I think one of the things that was most interesting to me was that we couldn't get consensus on what the prefix actually should be from a pre-negotiation basis. And so in typical good engineering fashion, we punted to make someone else solve that problem. Right? Maybe you talk a little bit about that and how that worked out and whether we felt like that was the right thing. Clearly it worked. I mean, it wasn't an issue in that way, but it was interesting seeing some of the go back and forth. And I don't think all that stuff was necessarily public. So maybe it's worth at least letting folks know.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty important detail. Like in the process of working on an IETF document, this one had a component that is, I would say it's less common. I don't want to say it's rare, but like it had a component of basically requesting resources from IANA. Most of the time, if you are masochistic like me and you read RFCs and stuff, you'll see that in pretty much all of them, part of the boilerplate is, are there any IANA considerations? And that usually says no. But for this one, there's a resource allocation involved. And so we basically had to go to IANA and say, we want to do this. Basically, the document is the justification. And if it isn't clear, we probably need to rewrite the document. But if it is, we want some resources. And this is sort of what we're looking for. And, we had to make suggestions from that because, it was a request that we were making. And it's essentially okay, we see you want to do this. What do you think it should be? And again, I think most of us had sort of settled on a 20 as the thing we were going to ask for. And if IANA says, we don't think that's enough, we'll give you more, or we think that's too much, we're not going to give it to you, that was sort of up to them.
Right.
But that was a sort of separate process that we needed to go through.
Yeah. It was interesting because basically the support for your draft goes through. Everyone says, yes, it's good, but it actually can't get issued out until IANA actually goes through their process. And then it gets updated to reflect what those allocations are. So it's, even though the document is passed through IETF and everyone's given the thumbs up, it still has to wait to get that portion of the information updated in the actual doc. So it's sort of like a post update. It's a little strange, right?
And admit it, you were like hyper refreshing that IANA special IPv6 special addresses page, waiting for it to
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was waiting to see what they were dropping for us. It's fascinating, at least from my side, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they actually asked us, is this okay? Like, will this work for you? And we said yes. Actually, this is interesting too, and this is sort of a whole subject in and of itself. But you mentioned like it goes through the IETF process of, you write an individual draft, an ID or whatever it's called, and then it gets adopted by a working group. And then once it's adopted by a working group, that's basically just a signal that, yes, we recognize that we need to work on this. Like people want to work on this. We recognize it as important enough to sort of take on. And sometimes the process dies there. Sometimes it goes on. And when it goes on, it goes to working group last call, which essentially punts it up. Working group last call, you get your final working group edits in there, pushes it up to the AD level. Then the AD sort of figures out what they want to do with it. Once it's past all of those things, then it goes through, I can't remember the exact term for it, but it's basically a bunch of AD approvals. Right. So like security has to look at it, transport has to look at, all of the relevant working group area directorates need to look at what that is and sort of read it and give it an approval. Then it goes and we make the request to IANA for the resource. Once we get that, it comes back And then it goes through a whole other editing process. That this is the part that I had never seen before, although it's actually really well documented. And this is where the RFC editor comes in, and they do basically everything to make it a final document. And they're very clear that, like, hey, make sure you read everything we're doing. If you want these changes, here's what we suggest. Give us explicit, like, yes or no. If you want something different, tell us exactly what that needs to look like, because once we publish it, it's an RFC and it does not change. Once you get that IANA in there, then there's a whole thing that comes after that too.
You'd asked me to write a Shepherd doc for this thing. Where did that fit into the picture?
Yeah, Shepherd doc comes, I believe, after working group last call is accepted.
And it's basically a summarization, try and be as unbiased as possible, the summarization of all the sort of opinions that were expressed through the mailing lists and where things sort of landed from a technical decision basis, to sort of boil that down for others to read and have some insights into what those conversations look like, right?
And it's also like a template that you have to fill out. The discussion was pretty straightforward on this one. It was only a handful of threads, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was about 150 or so messages in total, so it wasn't anything horrendous. And thank you very much, Tim Winters, for walking me through how to do that doc, because he has done just a crazy number of them. It's pretty remarkable, actually.
I always joke Tim Winters has done 80% of all Shepherd documents in the entire IETF. He just kind of smiles and laughs. That was a critical piece of it. Like, all of those things are important in getting it pushed through. But like, the IANA component is something that, like you mentioned, it doesn't exist in every RFC. So this is my first published RFC. And I'm glad that it had that component in there. And I'm glad that this document was as straightforward as it was, because it really allowed me to sort of study what the process looked like and understand, what works and what probably wouldn't work in trying to do more of these things.
I guess that leads into the next part, which is, how do you know that this addresses what the community actually needs or wants? And what's the process the IETF gets feedback about this stuff? Or does it just get released out into the void and you hope it gets used? And if not, you're sort of trying to grok what goes on next. How do you envision that?
Well, so that's, I think, what the operations directorate is supposed to do. V6 Ops Working Group is supposed to represent people that are actually doing things operationally. And so that's one of the reasons that every time I'm on here, I'm literally on any podcast, I say, hey, come join the list. If you're out there doing this stuff or you want to learn more about it, I sat on that list for like a decade and never posted a single time, right? It's just a good place to sort of watch how the sausage gets made or doesn't. Right. And I think that, we're supposed to represent the needs of the community at a consensus level, right? It's probably going to be, like I said before, everything's a compromise when it comes to, meeting the needs of everyone. And that's, I think, what we aimed for. That's what the ops group is supposed to be doing. That's what I consider to be part of the, core competency of my job as a working group co-lead, is bring in new people, make it welcoming, address what they need to have addressed in a way that sort of works for everybody, and then do it again and just keep doing it. Because it'll never really be done. Right now, this is a great example. The thing that this updated was 20 years old, right? It just needed refreshed. That will continue, right? And that continues with every standard, I think, except for IPv4, which I think they're not going to do anything more with that since a long time ago. But, it's a constant state of living documents, updates and refreshes and debates and things like that that are supposed to represent the community. And if people feel that they don't, join the list. Please, the more input we get, the better.
Yeah, I think it gives you good insight into where IPv6 is changing and growing. And I think that's incredibly important to sort of understand why things are changing in both the protocol from an operations basis and then also for the protocol itself, right, in the 6-man side. And maybe you quickly explain the difference between the two working groups.
Yeah, so 6-man is the IPv6 maintenance group. So it addresses changes to the actual underlying protocol. Like if we wanted to add a new field or something, or a new flag to a router advertisement, that comes through the 6-man working group. And it's more focused on sort of the mechanics of the protocol. The operations working group is more focused on, how does it work? And what do we do with it? What's the right way to do X, Y, and Z? Or what is a way that we know works to do whatever the task at hand is. So it can do things like produce BCPs, like the BCP38. This is a great example that didn't come out of IPv6 ops, but it's very well known. That's one that almost every network engineer that's ever touched BGP would know. We can produce those type of documents. We produce RFCs that sort of define, like this, the address space for documentation. Right now, we're working on myself, a couple other people, including one of the co-chairs from 6man is working on one to sort of create a considerations document for running IPv6 mostly, so that people will understand, like, these are some gotchas you need to look out for. This is how it's done.
Right.
And so ops is more like, this is how you do it. 6man is more like, this is the structure of the protocol and how it works.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets weird back and forth because, like, I think we started the work on 6724 in the ops side because we were like, hey, this operationally doesn't work. And then the protocol folks were like, oh, is that something we need to fix? Right. And like, how do you deal with that? Right. Back and forth. And what does that look like? It gets interesting. So sometimes you see threads that happen on both lists. So I'd actually encourage folks to join both lists so you can sort of see if things are getting blended back and forth.
Yeah, definitely join both lists. That's a really good point because it's IPv6, right? So
Yes.
what did I say at one point? Too much IPv6 could never be enough.
Nah.
Taking over the packet pushers. But there's a lot of overlap in people. There's a lot of overlap in sort of needs and requirements and stuff. And so being on both is definitely useful. 6man, it can get pretty deep into the technical details, which is pretty fun because I learned more about just the protocol itself. I came in thinking, I've done this a whole bunch. I know what I'm talking about, but I didn't know anything. I've learned a ton from that. And I think it's important to be on both. And if you're really, really into V6 stuff and you also do wide area networking, there's a new SRv6 ops mailing list, which I would encourage you to join if you're doing that kind of fun stuff.
Oh, very cool. I guess this is a good spot to ask you what you think is interesting that's moving through the IETF right now, whether it's V6 or not. What's the things that you're keeping an eye on? What are the things that you're keeping track of? What are the things that are catching your interest?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of personal irons in the fire. We're working on Jen and I, and actually, I think you just had him on a podcast from Ripe, Andrzej.
Oh yeah, Andrzej, the IPv6 Mostly podcast.
Yeah, so he and myself and Jen are working on that document, that, sort of V6 mostly considerations document, which there's already one version published. There's a new one. It's ready now. I think Jen will publish it any minute. That I think is a pretty good doc. I would recommend reading that for folks that are interested because it really sort of distills down the V6 mostly operational requirements. Then I'm also working on one which may be controversial for the DNS op group with a couple other folks, Tommy Jensen from Microsoft and again, Jen from Google, on deprecating RFC 7050 in favor of Pref 64. That has not published yet.
I want to hear a little bit more about that. Talk us through that one. What's the thinking around that?
I think 7050 is a problematic document in that there are some things in there that aren't really well defined and aren't implemented. And I think that it's mostly agreed upon, or maybe I have rose-colored glasses on, I don't know, that the DNS mechanism for finding your NAT64 prefix could probably be better served by switching to Pref 64, mostly because it exists within the protocol. It doesn't require sort of an external resource and, sort of makes things a lot more simple. Now, our document doesn't say it is now forbidden to do the DNS process. It just says, like, if you can do Pref 64, you should do Pref 64.
It's more efficient for a variety of reasons, right? In terms of just how the protocol stack works. So
it is. There's some stuff in 7050 that isn't realized that I think people don't understand isn't realized. Like some of the security features that are in it. Like I've never seen any of those ever implemented ever.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think they require IPsec, which is just gross and very cumbersome to maintain, and that should be addressed.
I wouldn't say they're logical flaws, but they're just some problems about which side is kickstarting what to get things going that hasn't been worked out and operationally was never done. So there's no examples to refer to. So you quite literally don't know how this actually would work in a functional environment and whether it would work or not, right? Because there's no demonstrated code to actually make it work.
Yeah. What's nice about 7050 is you only have to configure it once on one DNS server and it's cached. So based on the TTL and DNS. And so it's quite broad and you only have to configure it in one place and it can then indicate the Pref64 to many hosts. Pref64 configured in the router advertisement gives you very precise control,
Right.
but you have to configure it on every first hop router for every access segment. It gives you a lot of control. But, today, not every vendor gives you the ability to configure Pref64. Now, in terms of the standard, you may choose either option depending on your requirements. I'm glad that you're thinking Pref64 shouldn't, mandate that 7050, the DNS method, is forbidden, because there are merits, I think, to both in some situations.
We have a whole nother show.
Yeah. That will help me even further solidify my most frequent.
The title is still yours, Nick.
Nice.
For what it's worth.
We're going to keep it that way. No, I mean, I try not to be super prescriptive. I'm not a binary minded person like that. I tend to operate in the gray areas, which is weird because I'm working in standards, but I also understand that like you can't just shut the light switch off for something like that.
Yeah.
Right. There's always going to be an edge case, and there's always going to be a vendor that doesn't do it in a timely manner. But I think if we write this and it actually goes anywhere, it will make it very clear to vendors that are doing implementations that, hey, you should be doing this. Like this should be something that you are working on for V6 deployments.
If you have priority and features you want to build in your product, the standard should help you determine what the priority is.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
What else is catching your eye?
The 6724 update is
still in progress.
Still moving along. That I think is almost finished. I've been talking with the co-authors and the chairs of the 6-man working group, and I think they're ready to sort of make the final push on this.
Poor Jeremy. How many times did they make Jeremy rewrite?
I know, right? Yeah. Jeremy's been a trooper. I mean, I told him, he's like, I'd love to be involved in that. I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, okay. Our co-author, Tim Chown from the UK, I've known him for a very long time. He, works in research and education like I do. And he was one of the authors of 6724. He's been very critical in making this happen. I think if he would not have been involved, I would say I probably would have just banged my head against the wall until I couldn't anymore at this point, because it's been so long. But I think because we stuck with it, the document is much better than it would have been otherwise. Like, I think it's a useful document now. I think it's ready for the last call, and I think it's ready for publication, to be honest. It really took a couple of turns. And again, this is probably a whole show in and of itself, but like we defined the known local prefix, which didn't exist before, which I think is really what's pushed it over the edge, which is a new construct. This is a local prefix. It's never meant to leave. We're defining it, and all the hosts will know that it's local and that it should never be seen from outside, and that you use it to communicate inside, which is one of the problems that we've had in the past with 6724 is not every platform allowed you to do any changes. That was one of our complaints.
Right.
Like you couldn't make manual adjustments. And well, now you don't need to, assuming this gets implemented.
Yeah, I think it's good. And you guys went through quite a bit of work. If you want to follow quite an adventure, you can try and follow that thread.
And whoever does the Shepherd document for that has
not me.
A monumental task on their hands, years worth of threads.
Yeah, that's not going to be easy. Well, Nick, how can folks follow you on the internet? What's the way for folks to get a hold and get engaged with you?
Well, I've mostly given up on Twitter.
Fair enough.
I've got a Mastodon account that is forwarding plane at dial.modem.show. And then I also have been sort of poking around on Blue Sky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my handle's @Buraglio.forwardingplane.net. Maybe. I don't know. If you search for me, you'll find me. I'm pretty easy. Or you can find me on the mailing list.
Yep. Mailing lists and LinkedIn, I think, are great spots to connect with.
Oh, yeah. LinkedIn. I'm much more active on LinkedIn than I used to be now that I've sort of moved away from Twitter.
Yeah. Likewise. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, man, and giving us an update on this. And congratulations on the actual RFC publication. That's a big deal.
It was very much a group effort, and all three of you are mentioned in the acknowledgement section because it wouldn't have happened without you guys either. So I just happened to be, one of the ones that's at the top of the page, but I did no more work really than anyone else that was listed in the acknowledgements, right? It wouldn't have happened without everybody.
We really appreciate the tip of the hat, and probably more importantly for us, just because of what we do as a business, as a complete aside, this is useful for us in our day-to-day activities. So we appreciate that. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the goal, right? It needs to be operationally useful.
Yep. Well, it is.
So I'm happy to hear that. Hooray!
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of IPv6 Buzz. If you've got feedback or a follow-up on this topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Also, on packetpushers.net, you'll find a range of deep dive technical podcasts for IT pros, including heavy networking, heavy wireless, and Day 2 cloud.
There's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site as well, such as tutorial videos and a networking job board to help you find or fill your next great role. So whether you're deep in your career or just starting up, Packet Pushers is the place to go to grow both your skills and your personal network.
So long and until next time, we'll see you on the IPv6 internet.